Hi guys, I'm doing it's like an in-screen video. Every time I tried to record it, something recording the PowerPoint was backwards, so I didn't think that was very effective. So the easiest way I could do it was like this. So let's get started. Thanks. Let's get this up. Alright, so I decided to do reporting and assessing. My presentation, is about reporting and assessing English reading in Stage 1. So I'm going to be telling you all about how and why we assess student learning in Stage 1 for reading. So first, this is my rationale for assessment in reading for Stage 1. To determine the level of achievement in regards to the New South Wales syllabus outcomes, as they're obviously the outcomes that I'm relating it to grade students on their learning strategies and learning of the outcomes, to provide teachers with data on ways to improve student learning and teaching strategies, to understand student learning habits to inform future teaching, and to gather an understanding of student data for intervention and support purposes. So firstly, I'll start off with what is assessment and why do we do it. So according to the Victoria Department of Education, assessment is an ongoing process of gathering, analysing and interpreting evidence, so data that we collect from students, so things like tests, work samples, things like that. It's reflecting on findings, so we're reflecting on that evidence, so what we're finding, how well they're meeting the outcomes, what they still need to learn, what they already know, gaps in learning, and making informed and consistent judgments to improve student learning. Also, according to NESA, assessment is an important part to the teaching and learning cycle, and assessment gives teachers the ability to understand how well a student is meeting the outcomes, so the New South Wales syllabus outcomes, and it also detects areas for further development, so we can see what students are retaining and what we really need to explicitly teach a bit more, so gaps in their learning and things they might not be understanding. It's also really helpful with assessment to see how we're teaching, so we can reflect on our teaching. Maybe there are things we need to change, some differentiation we need to implement. It also allows us to understand how well students are developing skills that they're going to need for the rest of their lives, and reading is an essential skill that they will need. So what is assessment and why do we do it? When we assess, we use 3 different methods of assessing. So we've got diagnostic, formative and summative. Diagnostic is, so we're seeing what a student already knows, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and so maybe coming into a new unit, I would use diagnostic. You've also got a formative assessment, which assesses a student's performance during the instruction. So you might conduct formative assessments during a unit to see whether you can move on to a next topic, or whether there are still gaps, or whether they're actually getting it really quickly, so you might be able to move on. And then summative, so you would do that at the end of a unit. So it's assessing, measuring their achievement at the end, so how well they've done and how well they've met their outcomes. How do we do it? Alright, so there's 3 main approaches that we use for assessment. So we've got assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning. So assessment for learning occurs when teachers use student data and progress to inform their teaching. So like we just talked about, this would be diagnostic or formative. So when you're assessing for learning, you're doing maybe pre-testing to see what they already know and what things that you really need to focus your teaching on. When you are assessing as learning, so this is where students and teachers are reflecting on and monitoring the progress of their learning so far, so during the unit, and it helps also create their future learning goals. So this would be a formative type of assessment. And then you've got assessment of learning, which we talked about with the summative, occurs at the end. So we're collecting data and evidence of that student learning throughout the unit and making those judgments of how well the outcomes have been met. So in English reading in Stage 1, we need to understand how well students are progressing in a number of areas, like decoding words and understanding alphabetic code, understanding vocabulary, building on their vocab, linking known knowledge with the knowledge in the texts, checking meaning, so making sure they're not just reading the words, they're really reading to make meaning out of the story, analysing the information they're reading, and rechecking after it's been read, so responding to and making inferences from words and images. So making inferences is like reading in between the lines, so drawing information from the text that might not necessarily be written there. Transferring knowledge to new contexts and subjects, understanding different viewpoints that an author might be trying to get across and like intended audience and purpose of the text, and analysing messages and information in a variety of modes, so visual literacy, multimodal texts. Beautiful. So assessment for learning in English for reading, there's many ways we can do it. So we want to determine what level of students are reading at and how well their word recognition is and their fluency. So a good way to do this is complete running records. A running record provides information on a student's reading as it's happening. So we're taking these records as the student is reading to us. So a running record tells us a score of word reading accuracy, so how many words they're getting right, and it analyses the reader's errors and self-correction. So if they're reading something and has made an error, whether they're going back and correcting it themselves and have realised that they've made an error. And also we're looking at what reading strategies they're using. So are they stretching out words, sounding out? Are they fitting in other words to make sense? Are they looking at the picture for meaning? Those types of things. So by doing this, we can determine what level and difficulty they should be reading at, and then which then helps us to allocate readers and readers for them to take home for home learning, and also to give them in literacy centres, so reading groups. Here are some examples of a running record. So this one here that you see is the key. So what you'll see, so what the teacher will do. So if it's a self-correction, they might write it there. They tick above the word that they get right. They might be omitting words or inserting words. That's a big thing you see in Year 2. And then here is an example of a Year 2 running record. Sorry, it's not very clear, but alright, so assessment as learning in English reading. One of the ways we can do this and we can understand how well a student is progressing in their reading skills is seeing how well they're reading for meaning. So understanding different viewpoints throughout text and all those things we talked about in the previous slides. So a way we can do that is by using comprehension assessment tools. So by getting students to read a certain passage or book and then making inferences, which is reading between the lines, so drawing information from the text or answering questions. So this is how we can determine whether they are absorbing what they're reading and not just reading word for word. So these comprehension skills will progress more once a student has become more of a fluent reader. So they're going to find it hard to take meaning from a text when they're still reading word for word and struggling to sound out certain words. Here is an example of some comprehension. We've used 3, so I've shown you one that's above satisfactory, satisfactory and below. So there's 3 learning levels there. And I've also put in the outcomes that you might be assessing by doing this. So draws on an increasing range of skills and strategies to fluently read, view and comprehend a range of texts on less familiar topics in different media and technologies. So we're looking at how well a student can answer these questions related to the text. So you can see in above satisfactory, they've given quite detailed answers. Satisfactory is just a good amount, whereas you're below satisfactory, they're still working on getting as much information as they can. This is the grading system that we just saw, so the satisfactory, above satisfactory, below satisfactory. So it determines how well they're meeting the outcomes. So we can use this rubric grading criteria to see where they are and where they're at. So they can include a bigger scale, but generally they're based on this 3-point scale. That way we can determine whether we need to do some more intervention and explicit teaching. All right, assessment of learning. So there's so many ways we could do that for reading in stage 1. We're not necessarily assessing a unit for reading, but we're assessing what level they have reached by the end of that year, because a reading unit goes on and on and on through every year. So it's not a unit specific to stage 1, but it's something that they progress with each stage level. So we really need to have good insight into what reading level they are, how well they're going, to inform their next teachers. So I think it's really helpful to compare running records. So by doing one maybe the start and end of each term, you could even do it more frequently, to see their growth. So see how many levels they've gone up, have they made improvements, have they started incorporating different reading strategies, all those kinds of things. So at the end of each stage level, a student should be at a certain reading level. So this is also good to see whether they are falling behind or whether they're above. Next slide, you'll see, so this is how we can keep track of how a student is meeting their outcomes. So you'd put your assessment type in here and tick whether they've met their outcome. It's just a good little tracker. All right, providing feedback to students. This is a very important assessment tool, as students need feedback to clarify what they're learning and understanding their skills and how they are developing in relation to their outcomes. And also, clarifying how to improve their learning. So whether there are still areas that they need to be aware of, that they need to do, like punctuation, grammar, all those types of things, spelling, sentence structure. So it allows teachers to identify and inform students of strengths as well. So it's always really good to tell them of their strengths as well as areas for further development. It also gives them a chance for a bit of self-assessment and reflection. So I find it really helpful to conference with students one-on-one when doing this. Instead of just marking their book while they're not there and giving it back to them, it's not really teaching them anything or giving them anything helpful, because 9 times out of 10 they're not going to read what you've written or taken in what you've corrected. So you really need to do that one-on-one conferencing to make sure they're getting the feedback that you give them. There's heaps of different types of feedback we can use, like verbal, written, peer-to-peer. You might conference as a little group or have a whole class discussion. Providing them with this feedback, it's a really effective way to improve student learning, and it's also really good sometimes to get feedback from your students about your teaching. Here's an example of some written feedback. So the teacher would have conferenced one-on-one with this student about things they could change in their writing. All right, as teachers, we make consistent and comparable judgment through moderation. So moderation is a process where teachers will use a range of different, conference together with teachers from a different experience levels to compare work samples from their class and compare them to those achievement standards to develop appropriate marking criteria or strategies. And that's usually consistent over stage groups. So your stage 1 teachers will meet together and work out how they're going to grade. Your stage 2 teachers, etc. So that they're consistent over the whole year, sometimes over the whole school, just depends. So moderation allows teachers to have discussions about how to interpret achievement outcomes, student learning to meet outcomes, and success criteria. Moderation is collaboration underpinned by evidence, so it can be used before, as, or after assessment. Here is an example of a Year 2 English marking rubric that was constructed through moderation by a group of stage 1 teachers. So as you can see, they've got criteria on text structure, sentence structure, grammatic features, vocab, spelling, punctuation, handwriting. So this is more a writing rubric, but it gives you an idea on how they would mark their students. All teachers from stage 1 get this criteria. So, interpreting student data. So, teachers can analyse and interpret student data to establish and understand how their students are progressing with their learning. So, we read and we understand student data to assess meaning of outcomes. So, it's not just about assessing and getting back their mark. We need to be looking at it and understanding whether they are retaining all the information, where there are gaps in their learning, whether they're really behind. Maybe we need to differentiate, make it a bit easier, or conference with them one-on-one to give them a bit more explicit teaching. So we establish what students know, what they're in progress of learning, and what they do not know at all. So effective data interpretation also helps teachers understand improvements for their own teaching. So by looking at their data, we might see gaps in our own teaching strategies, and then we can adjust from there. Here is an example of some data collected on my Stage 1 prac of Year 2. So it's a spelling challenge. So I took this spelling challenge at the start and end of my prac, and it actually shows whether they've gained growth or whether they've had a decline. Most students had shown an amazing amount of growth, whereas some students were getting 20 out of 20 both times, or they'd show a little bit of a decline. So from this, we can understand which students need further help with their spelling, or maybe which students need a harder. So obviously the ones that are getting 20 out of 20 both times, you would look at maybe letting them go a little bit harder. And then you've got students that maybe might go really good the first time, but then go really bad the first time. This maybe indicates that child wasn't very engaged during that post-testing. So reporting on student achievement. So the reporting is the process of communicating information about student achievement and progress at a point in time. So there are so many ways that we can report on that learning. It's just not about collecting the data, but reporting it and letting people know of it. So you've got mid-year and end-of-year reports, parent-teacher interviews, and of course consistent parent contact. So emails, you might phone call. These reports are a great way to communicate development and progress of student learning, and of course areas that require further development. Just my references. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this has taught you or informed you enough about assessing in Stage 1 reading. Thank you.